Please check those. If not,
understand that serious problem. Maybe you will help us. Again, what I would like, the only thing I would like in the architecture, maybe to add use cases, that will be good enough. And then I'm going to decide what protocol. Right now, if you don't decide, I don't know to start getting too much work into this until. And I hope that next hackathon I will test this.
I'm going to send an email about the idea that David and I had about this upfront tutorial. Maybe that will also attract more people to the hackathon.
Thank you.
I'll do it right now, actually. Sorry? I will do it right now.
Good.
I think we're ready to go, right? Okay, let's get going. Close that. When did you say? I haven't seen this. I'll try to upload it to the link, and I'll just approve it. Did you? Okay, I'll take a look. Okay, welcome everyone to the first session of Oauth. We have two sessions. One today, and the other one is Friday morning. Friday morning we have 2 hours. Now we have an hour and a half. So let's get going. I think that is that note well by now. Hopefully you're familiar with this. So the blue sheets are out there already. We're looking for a Jabber scribe and a minute taker. Volunteers. Okay. Scribe?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Jim, scribe.
You can't proceed without a minute takers.
No, we have a minute.
Oh, Jabber or minute taker?
Whatever you need.
Okay.
We need a note taker for
Yeah. Okay. Anybody on Jabber?
Most people nowadays don't even know what Jabber is.
Yeah.
That's a whole different conversation.
Yeah. Nat, are you in Jabber there? No? Anybody in Jabber? No? Okay. Anybody can help us with Jabber? No? Nothing?
You just need to relay questions from
Yeah, just relaying questions,
You don't need
nothing.
to type anything.
It's easier.
You can do that? Does someone ask?
No, I'm not on Jabber.
Okay.
I clicked to join Jabber and it says so. I'll log in again.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's get going. So our agenda, we have 10 minutes for a chairs update. Then Daniel will talk about the Oauth security workshop for 5 minutes. Dick will entertain us about reciprocal Oauth after that. Daniel will then talk about security BCP. And Justin will entertain us this time about transactional authorization. And hopefully we'll have enough time for Annabelle. If we can't get that, we'll have to squeeze it into Friday. We'll see. Okay. So let's get started with the update. Thanks to Roman. We had made lots of progress recently. Thank you, and to the authors too. The first one, we're gonna talk about this later. I think on Friday, which is the access token JOT, the profile for that. Vittorio will talk about this on Friday. The browser-based app, we'll discuss this too on Friday. Device flow, I think it's in the editor queue, and there are some editorial changes, so hopefully will be done soon. I don't think there is anything blocking there. Incremental authorization, I think that this is something that the chairs will have to pick up and start providing a write-up on this one. I think that the document is ready to move on, but we were kind of trying to clean up stuff because we had lots of other documents. I don't know what's the latest with this one, the jar. Roman, I think it has a discuss, if I remember, and
Special effects.
don't remember what's the latest.
Right. Oh, right. So this is the long-standing document that was delayed. We didn't have enough ballots for it. There was an issue kind of with the state. Ben has put a discuss on it, and so we need a follow-up to the discuss that Ben had. So I think we're going to need a new draft to address those comments.
Okay. I believe the author's here. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It's really terrible what this document went through so far.
Yeah.
The discuss was actually on the concern about the IANA thing, thing, right? So in jar, we are putting all the Oauth records parameters into JOT, and the concern was the overlap between the JOT claims
I see.
and the Oauth parameters. So there has been some kind of coordination between the Oauth registry and JOT registry.
Okay.
That you, I think you have to repeat that. Like swallow the mic or something.
Yeah, get closer to the mic. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is not Sakimura. I repeat. So the discuss was about the concern over the overlap of the claims between the JOT claims and Oauth parameters, Oauth records parameters, because in jar, Oauth records parameters are recorded inside the JOT. So there has to be some kind of coordination between the IANA registry for Oauth records parameter and JOT. That's what we have to add.
Okay.
This is Brian Campbell with Ping. At one point, the same issue was raised with respect to effectively the same document in the OpenID AB Connect working group, and my understanding was that it had been decided there that that document on errata would register the most commonly used claims, those that were most likely subject to collision in the IANA registry for OAuth parameter names. Did that ever happen, or is that being considered as part of the solution? It did. It did not. I've gotten two different answers, so I don't know.
In the editor's drafts, the IANA considerations prepares to registry.
But they have not yet been registered. I see. So should that?
We're waiting until we finish the errata.
Okay. Does that need to be considered before we do something else with the registries to try to combine them? The scope of what you said there was a little bit concerning.
So I'll definitely look into that. Right. So it's two separate registries, right? And there has been some text advising the IANA editors to do the coordination as well. Because so if whether we should actually register all the authorization, all authorization parameters into the JWT registry.
Is this something you guys could sort out during this week and come up with a sort of an idea of that? I think till the next session. How is that?
Certainly. I just was looking to avoid something overreaching there that we might regret.
We would really like to finish this document because this was really
it's been there. It's been there for a long time, for sure. Okay, thank you. BCP. What is the latest on this one? Oh, it got to discuss too. Okay. Who's that? BCP. Was that Jeroen's document?
Yeah, the Mike.
Mike, what's
for that one?
What's the latest with the BCP?
What's the question?
What's the latest on that document? It has we believe a discuss. Like what's the plan for that?
Yeah, we have one discuss. The editors, including yourself and I and Dick, have been reviewing the comments. There's responses which you created to some of them. I think this week we need to sit down together and create responses to the rest of them. It wasn't the kind of discuss that, is of the tenor of we're going to stop the document. It was the kind of discuss where we're trying to improve the exposition of the text.
Okay.
And so we need to, ideally this week, while the editors are here, create responses to that, discuss and progress.
Okay, awesome. Good, thanks, Mike. Okay, I think there was good progress with the introspection response document. I think that it's waiting to anything.
There were some changes made based on my AD review. All the issues were cleared, but there was one minor finesse that I'm requesting, and so when that finesse gets added, we can move that towards last call.
Okay, perfect. MTLS, I think it's IETF last call already, right? Key distribution, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so the key distribution one is an interesting topic because last time I talked about this briefly, and then there was this question that came up of what happens in a case where the key that the client is presenting for inclusion into the access token is not the same that is being used for authentication by the client to the authorization server. And we tabled that issue, and a coworker of mine did a formal analysis of it, and which concluded that it's fine from that point of view. And he posted it to the list, but there was no follow-up discussion on this afterwards. So maybe this is also a topic that a few of us, Daniel and I, and maybe someone else who is into that topic should discuss during the week and come up with a story specifically in the context of Depop, because it touches on that aspect as well. And if you guys think we should nevertheless sort of have a separate mechanism to prove possession of the private key from the client to the authorization server in the specification, which is currently not there. Currently, it's only it would be done from the client to the resource server. Then we need to do that as soon as possible, because this is a document that fits into the ACE work where we try to make alignment. And you may remember all these discussions that we had with the ACE group. And so this is sort of the HTTP part of the counterpart of what they have been doing in co-op. So we need to figure this out. I understand that this is maybe a little bit beyond what most people want to look at, formal analysis of specifications, but I think it's a good thing that we do that.
Roman did. I would +1 anytime we can get a formal analysis of our protocols. This is good verification and validation about what we're doing. So this is great.
Yeah, it was actually something that we did a tutorial on at the Oauth security workshop, which I think Oauth security workshop will again be covered later.
Okay, good. Thanks. Okay, reciprocal OAuth we'll talk about later on. Resource indication, I think it's a IETF last call. A security topic, we'll talk about this later on. And token exchange, same thing. It's I think IETF last call, is it?
Yeah, the
No?
token exchange has progressed. It's been approved by the IESG. It's in the editor's queue.
Ah,
So
okay.
it's quite close.
Okay, awesome. Good. Thank you. Okay, next, let's move on. How do we get out of this? No, that's not what it was. How do you exit this damn thing? Okay. Okay, Daniel, do you want to come up here, please? See if this works.
Something's broken with the display.
Oh, yeah, hold on. Yeah.
Full screen.
Yeah, full screen it. There you go. Try now.
Yeah, thank you. As many of you know, we have this OAuth security workshop since 2016, the fourth edition of which we held in March in Stuttgart, Germany. This security workshop is a place where we have 3 days of talks and discussions. We have lots of time to discuss issues in depth, much more than we have at this event. It started out as a venue to discuss security topics, but nowadays, of course, we also talk about many other topics in the OAuth space and OpenID Connect space. At the latest iteration of this workshop, we not only had a pre-scheduled schedule, but also an unconference time, which I think was very useful. People came up with a lot of interesting topics and a lot of also spontaneous ideas to discuss stuff. Now the question is, where do we want to hold the next event? So as you can see, the last ones were in Trier, Germany, and Zurich in Switzerland, Trento, Italy, and then Stuttgart in Germany. And now we'd like to find a location and a time for the next event. Where can we do that? Well, I heard 2 proposals regarding that. First one is Steinar Noam. He proposes to do something in Norway. There are multiple locations possible, for example, Oslo or Trondheim. Of course, there are also much more remote places in Norway where we could go, which is essentially a trade-off between travel time and vacation quality.
That's a Trondheim.
Thanks for the word. What's that?
That's a Trondheim joke.
Yeah, and we could also do that in Stuttgart at the group of 5 Küsters. They said they would at least fill in if nobody else would do that. They could host the event as well. And when would we do that? Well, if we have it in Europe, then maybe not. We don't attach it to the IETF event 107, which would be in Vancouver, but we might do that in May, where the EIC is in Munich, or close to the IETF 108 event, which is in Madrid, Spain. I do understand that Spain is not exactly close to Norway, but I think it's close enough.
It's on the same continent.
It's the same continent, exactly. Okay, does anybody have another proposal, something that is in favor or against one of these locations?
So if you have some contacts to universities, or if your company is willing to host such an event, then we are talking about like a 50-person type of event.
Say 70.
Or 70.
Yeah.
Then
So
that would.
I may be able to rustle something up in Vancouver.
Uh-huh.
Knowing one or
Okay.
two people there. So that's not out of the question if people wanted to have it in Vancouver. I mean,
Do you want to go to the microphone? Or? Yeah. Nobody from remote can hear.
The computing science department at UBC is quite likely to want to sponsor something like that. So if people want me to pursue it, then I can.
I like Norway.
Yeah, I mean, I have reason to go to Trondheim, so I'm down with that. But Vancouver is also not, well.
But
it
Vancouver
maybe
is very
isn't
close
the
to the
sunniest
IETF
time of
meeting.
year in Vancouver in May, but the UBC is nice.
Yeah. So that's good. So please think about it, and please ask your employer or friends from the university. We would like, obviously, start planning fairly soon.
Yeah.
Torsten says Norway.
I'll just go and offer that if you want to come to Stockholm, I can probably host there.
Okay, Scandinavia going strong here.
Do we have some
Stockholm's
Finn?
slightly easier to get to than Trondheim.
It's in the same level as Oslo, I think.
Eve says that she can check on for drug sponsoring Bristol, UK. And there's a small office in Oslo too.
Okay.
In terms of places that we've been, Scandinavia is more diverse than Vancouver.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
There's a different kind of diversity going on.
Okay.
But Microsoft actually has large meeting spaces downtown.
So I know.
Okay, so if you have good ideas or know somebody who is willing to sponsor this, just contact me. We'll probably make a decision here soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Dick? There you go. I'm driving.
Hello, everybody. So the last time I talked about this, Hans was confused as to how it worked. So I put together, you were?
I'm always confused.
I was giving you the benefit of the doubt about other things in life. But it wasn't clear. At times I get confused thinking about it, like who's doing what and where is it going, because it's you're switching back and forth quite a bit. And so I added to the draft ASCII art diagram, which I've got in nice art here. Is that big enough? People can kind of see that? Can people in the back, can you read it? Okay, excellent.
Romerdale, you can always put the nice art into the RFC. It's SVG. Yeah.
That's beyond my graphical capabilities. But also the ASCII art then is in the text version also, as opposed to not. And I already drew it, so this was easy to do in Keynote. So this is just your standard OAuth. Somehow you go and you get an authorization request to the resource owner, you get some kind of grant back, and then you make a call with that grant, and then this is the one place where things change, which is the authorization server says, hey, I would like to go and get a token as well, optionally, and can go and put in a request of which scopes it would like to have. At that point, the client's really starting to change to be the resource owner, and it's saying, okay, well, here's what the reciprocal, this is what the other guy wanted if he asked it. Otherwise, it's potentially pre-configured what party B wanted. And then the resource owner calls the Auth server. Did you have something you wanted to add, Mike?
No, I'm talking.
Okay. Can I start again? Thank you, Mike. So that it hands over the grant, and party B knows the context because it's getting back its access token. And so that's why we can sort of do this behind the scenes, because you've got context there. Before the resource owner sends that over, there's likely some interaction, because from a user experience point of view, if you're going through the browser, you're back over at the party that started off making the request, and then it can ask the user, is it okay for the other party to do these things with you? And so you would be getting consent from the user at this point before you make this call over. And so you make the call over, the other side knows which user it is because of the access token, hands a grant over, and the client then goes and does the reverse of essentially what was C there, and oops, I pushed the wrong button back. And then it gets back its access token. That all makes sense, or is it still confusing? Okay. So that's what I've added, which hopefully makes it more clear to people what is going on in the process. I think last time people made a couple of comments on the doc, which I didn't take as notes, and I didn't put them in there, so if they could make those comments again. Well, actually, I think I did take them as notes, but I don't have that laptop anymore, so they went away.
Everything is recorded on YouTube, so you should be.
Well, I know, but that's somebody. I don't know that it was in the minutes of the meeting. It was something I wrote down. Okay. So I think maybe we're ready for last call on this, or people to read it over and look at some nits of anything.
So, can we see show of hands who read this document?
Diagram's the only main difference, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
Was that you half read it, Brian? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess like we didn't see any significant kind of changes or requests to change something. So it seems to me. So yeah, it seems to me, I think it will force also people to kind of look at it again. So I think it makes sense to call for a work group last call and see how that goes, right? So that's what we think we will be doing here. Go ahead. Have a comment?
Hi,
Yeah.
Martin Friend. I know I didn't give you this comment last time, but one of the things the current draft does is it launches into this diagram immediately. So there's like a 1-paragraph introduction, and then there's this diagram. And something that would be helpful, I think, is to just prepare the user with a use case, right? That in the introduction, you have this sort of generalized, here's why we're trying to do this, right? But I think before we get to the actual flow, which is great, by the way, kudos to that. But I think that it would be really helpful to have a use case as something that the reader could use the flow to read against. And I know I did say this at one time, but I know there's nothing to be done here, but I hate the word reciprocal. Because we have a mutual draft and now we have a reciprocal draft, and the mutual draft is home and gone, right? And now we have reciprocal, but I know there's nothing to be done there because that does describe the flow. If there were another word in English that you could think of, that would be wonderful, but that's just a suggestion and not a requirement. Thanks.
Yeah, if you have another suggested word, since we did move from mutual to reciprocal.
Yeah.
To keep the different mutuals clear. Yeah.
We did move from mutual because it's otherwise confusing, right? So, go ahead, Anand.
And that's Sakimura, number research. So when I was reading, I was really quite sure first time whether we are talking about at least two, or if there are two resource owners or just one. In this case, it's just one resource owner doing the authorization for both parties, right? Did you get my question?
I understand I'm thinking. The use cases I think of, there's one resource owner, but I'm thinking there's situations where there may be more than one, but I'm not sure. So I don't
It
know.
wasn't
I don't know.
crystal-
Yeah, let me think about that. That's a good comment.
It wasn't crystal clear.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I'd have to change the diagram and just say resource owner instead of A and B. Yeah, that's a good comment. As was the suggestion to add a use case. I will do that. Thank you.
Okay, I think if you can update the draft with the latest comment, just to address those, and then we'll call for a work group last call. Now that
Okay.
makes sense. Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Okay, I think Daniel, do you extract? Did you?
No.
Oh, okay. F5 again. Oh, there's no. Well, use the browser itself. Well, this is Friday. No. I'm not sure. Oh, come on. Where's
Let me
the-
just start here. The first slide is not that important. So it's me again. Hello. So I'd like to talk about the Oauth security best current practice. It's currently a working group draft, and it's very close to a finished state. What's in the draft? Well, this BCP refines and enhances the security guidance that we already give, for example, in RFC 6819, and also in the security considerations of 6749 and 6750. The important thing here is that we have a updated and more comprehensive threat model than before. We have described many attacks that were discovered recently or over the last years, let's say. And we have concrete and actionable recommendations for implementers of Oauth to defend against these attacks. What did we do since the last IETF? Well, there have not been too many changes. One change is that we now discourage the use of the resource owner password credentials grant. We say it must not be used. I think the reasoning is pretty clear. This grant type exposes credentials to the client. It's essentially a planned man-in-the-middle attack. It increases the attack surface that users are exposed to, or users' credentials. And it's not easily adaptable to many modern authentication mechanisms like two-factor authentication, web crypto, and the multi-step authentication that you have, for example, at Google. So we say the resource owner password credentials grant must not be used. The next thing is an input by Neil Madden. He noticed that in some rare cases, a client may be able to impersonate a resource owner. That can happen if there's a confusion between the sub-claim that is used for a client in the client credentials grant and the sub-claim that is used for a resource owner in the authorization code grant. And this may happen if, for example, the client uses dynamic registration and the client itself can influence its sub-value that is later used by the AS for that client. Yes,
Just to
Justin?
make sure, how? The client is not allowed to choose its client ID in dynamic registration. So
If there's any way to essentially influence that.
okay, so just if it's allowed to set some other field and then it generates something that becomes
exactly.
Oh,
Exactly.
Okay. Having not read the draft,
Yeah.
I would recommend that language be very clear that it's not talking about picking client IDs.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think it should be clear, but we can talk about that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then so the sub value might be influenced and confused for a sub value of a resource owner. So the recommendation is clear. The client should not be able to select or influence the sub value that is later used for the client. The next batch of changes is around PXE. We encourage the use of the PXE mode SHA-256 instead of the plain mode. This is because the authorization request might leak to an attacker, or parts of it might leak to an attacker, or whatever. So it's a really good idea if the PXE challenge is a hash of the verifier and not the verifier itself. Therefore, we say that the client should use a PXE code challenge, or should use PXE code challenge methods that do not expose the PXE verifier in the authorization request, which currently is the SHA-256 mode, essentially. We also say that authorization servers must support PXE, because PXE is super useful. Authorization servers should publish PXE support. We go back to that point in a moment. And we say that under certain conditions that we define in the BCP, PXE may replace state for CSF protection. And if PXE is used instead of state for CSF protection, then you're free to use state to carry application state or whatever you want. We have defined the conditions under which a client may opt not to use state but PXE for CSF protection, because it's very important that the client knows what it does in these cases. So, So we have essentially two open topics that we'd like to discuss. The first thing is, do we want to make metadata, so ARFC's 8414 AS metadata, mandatory? The background is a client can rely on the protection that PXE provides only when they know that AS supports PXE. So in particular, a client need to know if the AS supports PXE, for example, when they want to drop using state as a CSF protection. So the question is, currently we say the AS should use metadata to announce support for PXE, but we could also say the AS must use metadata to announce the support for PXE. And because we also say that every AS must support PXE, this would mean that the metadata RFC essentially becomes a mandatory to implement for OAuth authorization servers. In your opinion, would this be a good idea?
John Bradley, Ubico. I think that maybe mandating the use of metadata, no matter how tempting it may be for some of us, might be a step too far. I think it's probably okay to say, if the AS doesn't advertise PXE in its metadata or have metadata, you can't assume that the server does PXE, so it's not safe to rely on it.
Yeah, that's essentially the current status. Yeah.
So I think that's probably okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for arguing in favor of mandatory metadata.
No, Vittorio Oauth. Looking at the authorization service I work with, I don't think that this would be reason enough to cajole them to actually adopt metadata, mostly because most of them already use the OpenID Connect metadata for the information that they needed to publish, such as signing keys, issuer value, supported claims, and similar. So if you wanted to meet what they already have, if you find a way of adding these to the OpenID Connect metadata, which is already very widely used, then you could, I think you'll have more success in trying to get people to adopt. But the authorization server metadata I haven't seen a lot, and I don't think that people would go this direction just for this.
Yeah. John?
There's no reason why the same metadata entries can't be in the OpenID Connect metadata. That's sort of the way that the world normally works anyway. And we have this sort of odd situation because of Get Off My Lawn. The way that multi-tenant metadata works is slightly different between OpenID Connect and OAuth, but in general, it's the same file and the same entries.
Aaron Parecki from Okta. Would it be another alternative to say that Pixie should be announced in documentation? Would that like be an acceptable way for clients to know whether the AS supports it?
In documentation?
In documentation, this would be assuming, of course, like one client knows which AS it's talking about. Seems like that would solve it, though.
Yeah, actually, so this is a bit abbreviated. So one solution could be to write that, or the text that we would use would be AS must use metadata to announce support for Pixie, or another way that is implementation specific, which could be the documentation.
Sounds good.
Okay. Okay, so any other comments on that? No. Okay, so yeah, one solution would be must, or so must metadata, or another implementation specific way. Okay. And the next topic is an attack that is possible on Oauth under certain circumstances that we discussed in Stuttgart briefly, and that I'd like to discuss a bit more here, because I'd like to write something on this attack in the BCP, because we know of this attack, we need to write something, and yeah, the question is what we write. It's called the Pixie Chosen Challenge attack, although it's not a direct attack on Pixie, but it circumvents Pixie in a way. In order to launch that attack, we need an attacker that can read the authorization response. There are many ways in which this could happen. For example, because the URI is leaked or locked somewhere, maybe because there's a mix-up attack, or there's a component used on a mobile device which leaks these URIs, or something like that. And an attacker needs to be able to bring his victim to open some arbitrary URI. And now the attack works as follows. The attacker starts a session with the client and gets the authorization request URI from the client. So the attacker just starts, says just start a new session, get the authorization URI. Now the attacker forwards that authorization URI to the victim, unmodified, and the victim will open that URI and see the authorization/authentication dialog at the AS. Why would the victim now authorize/authenticate? Well, maybe because the victim was expecting something like that, but maybe for a different app. So the victim might be tricked into authorizing the client, or the victim doesn't even see anything regarding authorization authentication. We'll get back to that in a moment. So the victim authenticates and authorizes the client to access her data, and then the redirection back to the client happens. But now, since we're in the user's browser, not in the attacker's browser, the redirection back to the client will not be accepted by the client, because the client doesn't have a session with that user. And as I said before, now the attacker can read the redirection response, the authorization response. So the code leaks to the attacker, and the attacker can send that code and whatever else is in that URI to the client. The client will exchange the code for a token and will use that token from now on. in a session to which the attacker has access to. So the attacker can use the grants associated with that access token through the client. Okay, so essentially what happens is the authentication/authorization part is outsourced by the attacker to the victim. So what can we do against that? As it turns out, none of the existing defenses in Oauth help against that. We could use token binding, yeah, but there's a lack of support, famously, in some browsers. We could use the form post response mode, which would be a relatively big change depending on what your implementation looks like. It's also not suitable for apps. We could check the origin or referrer header at the AS so that the AS would see that the authorization request comes from a different origin. Unfortunately, the authorization request is a GET request, and the fetch specification says that there's no origin header in such a request. Yeah, and that's essentially the end of the things that we could do. I discussed this with John yesterday, and we came up with a new mechanism, a relatively simple mechanism, which could defend against this attack. And I called this mechanism IVAR, which may or may not resemble Scandinavian furniture. But it stands for Integrity Verification for Authorization Requests. The idea is, as I said, relatively simple. The AS needs to check that the authorization request actually comes from the client itself, not from the attacker. So the attacker didn't forward anything to the user's browser. How would it do that? The idea is that the client, in its metadata, publishes a so-called IVAR URI. The client then, before redirecting the user to the authorization server, stores the authorization request URI in the web storage of the user's browser, on its own origin, of course. Now the user is being redirected to the AS, and the AS then opens an iframe from the IVAR URI and sends a post message to that iframe. That post message would just contain the authorization request URI as it's seen by the AS. The iframe would check the local storage of the client, because it's running on the client's origin, would then see, okay, there's an entry of that URI, and would then answer okay. And if it doesn't answer okay, the AS doesn't continue with the authorization flow. So what we're doing is we are ensuring the integrity and origin of all the data in the authorization request URI. And while this seems like a big change, I think it's actually not such a big change. Because, for example, if you don't have JavaScript enabled, you can safely fall back to a mode which doesn't provide the protection by IVAR, but still works. We have integrity/origin checks for not only the PXE data or anything. So we have the full authorization request URI that is checked. So state, nonce, request URI if you're using that, and also the redirect URI. So we are also getting rid of many or most of the attacks targeting the redirect URI. And this mechanism protects against at least 3 attacks that I know of: the PXE chosen challenge attack, attacks using a manipulated redirect URI, and at least 1 variant of the AS mix-up attack. I know that this, this is very new. As I said, I came up John and I came up with the idea yesterday. So I wrote a draft on that, and I'd like to hear your feedback.
So, sorry, is that a separate draft or is it part of this?
That's a separate draft. So in the security BCP, we would probably make this in a formal reference, because we would not say you have to implement that. It would be, this is one way to do it. You could also use token binding if you know the browser supports. You could also use the form post mode if you are willing to change your implementation. Or you could opt for not doing anything like this if this is not in your attacker model.
Right. So this would be a separate draft. John Bradley, Yubico, again. This is the best bad idea we could come up with.
Yep.
I'm not proud. Don't feel clean about it or anything, but it is a thing. It's pretty much the only effective thing that we could think of without token binding. Token binding would be a better solution.
Yep.
This does run the risk of being blocked in Safari by Apple's somewhat over.
Actually, I don't think so. So I checked some of the documentation that is available, and they say
not yet, but
yeah, at some point it might.
Future plans is
Yeah.
because we're doing something using post message with iframes cross site. It could get swept up in anti-tracking technology in the future, so it's not without risk. But it's something you could do.
So the current status regarding, so I read some documentation on the current tracking protection mechanism by Apple. Maybe there's somebody in the room who knows this stuff better than I, but as far as I understand, the current policy is that if you interact with some website and then this website is used in a third-party context, then it's fine. So cookies or web search will be preserved in that sequence of events. What's that? In the main browser, yeah. So top-level window context, you interact with the client. That's what we see here, and then it's loaded in a third-party context. That should be fine with the current status.
So as I understand it, Annabelle Backman, Amazon, as I understand it, Chrome and Firefox also are supposed to be blocking local storage when third-party cookies are disabled. So this is not just a Safari issue. Given the increased attention on things like third-party cookie settings, this strikes me as a solution that has a very short effective lifetime.
Yeah, so as far as I know, the blocking, again, affects cookies set in a third-party context. This cookie/web storage would not be set in a third-party context, but read.
Third-party cookie settings generally block reading as well. Otherwise, they're pretty ineffective.
From all origins. So there's also this.
Can't speak to specifics of implementations, but yeah, I would be very nervous about this surviving future browser iterations.
So
your name, please.
Oh, sorry, Leif Johansson. It looks like you're like a bunch of stuff, like your cookie jar and a lot of other stuff related to it is being sandboxed. That's how it appears to the browser, right? So it looks like you have a cookie jar and you have browser local storage sometimes, but nothing ever persists. So it's like an empty. It's an empty object always. So it's not a good experience. No.
Told you it was the best bad idea. There were worse ones.
Sure.
What's the second best?
Yeah, let's hear that. If you can't redirect the user to like a main browser window in the flow, then this is not going to work.
Proxying late to the mic, Philip says WebKit's IPT 2.0 is famous for blocking cross-origin access to local storage, so disabling JavaScript isn't the only case. Isn't the only case a fallback would have to run for.
What's that? Last word?
So disabled JavaScript isn't the only case a fallback would have to run for.
Yeah, that's right.
Brian of Ping, I'm not sure I'm smart enough to have followed all the details of the attack, and certainly not how token binding would fix it, but I'm wondering aloud, there are a great number of similarities between how token binding works and what we're kind of looking at in Depop.
Yeah, Depop wouldn't help.
It would not help.
No.
Okay, maybe you could explain that to me sometime. We didn't even take the time.
Essentially, we came up with this as an alternative to Depop because Depop technically runs into the same cross-origin issues, et cetera, because you're trying to use it in the browser. What this does is provide the IDP a guarantee that the request from the client is coming through the same browser that the client sent the request to.
Depop is not bound to the browser, so it would just say this is from the API, but it might be in a different browser.
Sort of a side effect of the way token binding works.
So no, it is.
Well, essentially,
the goal of token binding is that because you have the referred token binding that's signed by the browser coming through, so you get the provided in the referred token binding at the AS, and when it goes back, you can make sure that it went end to end through the same browser, et cetera. So this is doing sort of at the application level a hokey thing that emulates referred token binding.
Yeah. Maybe we can do a side session on that attack later and discuss the details and mitigations.
Philippe wants to also remind us that rendering a blank page on every authorization endpoint to execute this just blows a nice UX. That might concern some.
Yeah, but you could hide it something. Not sure.
No, I'm proxying. So.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so we need to wrap this session up. So what I will do is I will describe this attack, or my plan is to describe this attack in the Oauth BCP, security BCP, and also discuss some of the mitigations, which might or might not include this mitigation. But we need to talk about the attack because we know of the attack, so we shouldn't just leave it out from the BCP. But other than that, the BCP is almost ready for publication. So there are no big things we need to change. And what's it? Yeah. Vittorio?
Sorry. One thing about they must not use ROP. I support that. But I think it would be nice if we'd have some kind of answer for some of those scenarios where people have absolutely no alternative. Like the scenario where I stumbled upon very often in the last few years when we were trying not to make this happen was SQL connection strings. Like imagine that you already have a wealth of scripts that you built for the last 20 years. You want to be able to reuse those scripts as is. You have no opportunity whatsoever of showing anything at all because it's a connection string. So we can certainly tell people don't use ROP, but people will keep having to use these kind of things. And the attempt to use authorization servers as their authorizer, it's there. So those guys will be in non-compliance. So if there is anything at all that we can do for those scenarios that we deem is better than the ROP, then we should hint at that. Otherwise, we'll just tell people, you guys are orphaned. We throw you away from the house of a father. You cannot use our stuff.
So do you have any idea what we could propose there?
So far, normally in those cases, I tell people, I understand, and
But it's not like everything on the web needs to be OAuth, right? So
no, exactly.
That solution might just be out of the.
Exactly. So what I suggest is we can actually call out saying if you are in this situation, then OAuth is not for you, for example. Instead of leaving people in this limbo in which they really want to do the right thing, that we leave no way out.
Yeah.
So we should just be explicit saying, sorry, in your scenario, you can't solve this scenario using X.
Yeah, maybe you could propose a text for the BCP.
Some language.
Yeah.
I'll do it in Italian.
Yeah, that's fine. I just put it through Google Translate and copy paste.
Daniel, I feel a little bit uneasy about the fact that you just discussed this attack. It's very brand new. People haven't had.
No, it's not brand new. We first talked about that attack about 1.5 years ago.
Well,
and we presented it at the Oauth security workshop.
But essentially, my takeaway from the discussion so far is like it's a new document new solution. The other solutions are not really viable.
Yeah, but that document is essentially out of the scope of the BCP. So
why is that?
So it's an old attack, and we decided we would address it by using token binding for the request response. And given that that may not be an option for a large number of people, we came up with an alternative. So what's new is the alternative, not the attack.
But I see this ready for publication in front of me, and I feel sort of uneasy about sending the document over to Roman and say, "Oh, here's now the best current practice," and then he will look at the slides of this meeting and say, "Are you really sure?" And I'm not. You know what I mean?
Well, we can say that there's a known attack that we don't have any mitigation for.
Well, it's not like we don't have any mitigations.
Well,
we do have mitigations
of the token binding in the token binding spec, not in the token in the Oauth. What is the spec? The spec that we have that uses token binding provides a mitigation for this, which we thought would cover it. We can say use that, or.
Also, this will probably unfortunately not be the last attack that we ever discover. So,
in principle, that's the advantage of BCPs, is that we have an infinite work stream.
Yeah.
Updating things over time.
Simple and actionable recommendations.
Roman Jr., since we were speaking of me, I'll speak for myself. I mean, very practically, it seems weird to me that we're declaring a BCP and then we're having a lot of conversation. Did we agree on what we said? And so that is odd to me.
Yeah. So we have to continue that conversation and try to come up with a good story. But it is thanks for trying hard and using the time yesterday coming up with something.
Okay. I think we are running out of time.
Yeah.
We do.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. So let's come on. There you go.
All right. Can you full screen that, please? Can you full screen that, please?
I thought we did.
Thank you. All right. Well, there's. Is it not there yet? Yeah, it's not there yet. So if it did.
Now.
There we go. Except the clicker's not working. Yeah. There we go. Okay, we're good. Sorry. I've got about 18 minutes for 68 slides, so we're going to do what we can. I'm going to talk about who's who. Oh, I don't. Shut up, Dick. My name's Justin Richer. I'm going to talk.
Justin,
what?
Don't go so close to the mic. It's extremely
Oh,
loud.
okay. Yes. I'm apologies. Okay. Thank you. Stop talking now, Dick. So we're going to be talking about transactional authorization, because if you look at where Oauth started about a decade or more ago, we had 2 RFCs and the world seemed nice and simple, but today it looks more like this. There's a lot of other stuff that's going on in the world that you need to understand in order to understand what's happening with OAuth. And it's arguable that a new developer needs to be able to thread their way through all of these, and that's why we're building so many different BCPs to help people guide through all of this space. In addition to that, as we were just hearing, there are a lot of cases where OAuth doesn't fit. And so I've been thinking that OAuth 2, as we know it and as we have it built today, is really starting to reach its edges. So over the last year or so, I've started to do an experiment of trying to see what it could look like if we kind of started with a new base. So something that was not specifically OAuth 2 compatible, And that has led me to the XYZ project, so named because on a lark I bought the domain oauth.xyz, and that seemed like a reasonable place to host this. So that is a website you can go to and follow along during the talk. I want to reiterate here that this is not an extension to OAuth 2. This is not a profile of OAuth 2. This is not wire compatible with OAuth 2, and that's on purpose, and I'll get to why in just a bit. A lot of the problems that we have with OAuth 2 and a lot of the attacks we have are dealing with the front channel. And now the front channel is a wonderful, it's a wonderful innovation that's been used in the OAuth and OpenID worlds because the user is there in the browser, is an incredibly flexible platform. But on the downside, there's a whole lot of stuff that can go wrong when you're pushing information through the front channel. Now, this is all reasonable to work with, except for the fact that OAuth 2 puts lots of things through the front channel. Right? There's a lot of stuff that goes on, and this causes a lot of problems. So many problems that we've got a whole list and an ever-growing list of specs to close holes in the front channel. So we're basically closing holes that we created in the first place. So my proposal started with the idea of let's not use the front channel unless we absolutely have to. Let's only use it for very specific things. And as I started to work on that, I started to take a step back of how could we do that with an OAuth-like protocol, and I kind of stumbled into the idea of using a transaction as the key thing. Now, OAuth has always been transactional. It's all about the client getting a token and then getting it authorized and using a token, et cetera, and so forth. What I decided to do with this project was make that transaction sort of the singular key element. So this is the intent registration pattern. People are using this in extensions to OAuth today. Open Banking UK, SIBA is using it, FAPI's got their own edition of it. And what I decided to do was, if instead of trying to build something with OAuth 2, build a protocol based on this concept to begin with. Now, the client starts by talking directly to the AS in the back channel and sending a JSON post. Because it's 2019, we can use JSON in a request. Yay. And it contains a bunch of different information about what the client is trying to do. First off, there's this notion of what I want. Torsten Lutterstadt's got a really great blog post that talks about structured scopes and the kinds of things we want to see there. I do not want a garden path about the actual things in here because, as far as I'm concerned, there's a whole lot of debate that needs to happen. The important thing here is that those are rich objects. They are JSON objects that can describe in greater detail what the client is asking for. Next, the client needs to be able to tell the authorization server how to recognize me. Now, this could be something, so the client's going to send a key or key reference to the server, much like it does with Depop and related things like that. Now, this might be a key that the server knows before, and it kind of understands that there are certain rights associated with it, or it could be a key that the client has generated on device because it's a mobile application installation instance, and it's able to create that key pair and start it off. The important thing is that the client has to prove possession of all referenced keys with every call that it makes to the authorization server. We'll come back to that refrain. I think this is a place where we need to be flexible. The thing that I have spec'd right now is just take that post body, use a detached JWS, put it in a header, call it a day. We could use cabbage signatures. We could use MTLS binding. There's a lot of different things we could do, and I think there's a lot of good innovation we can do there. Next up, the client can say a little bit about itself. So this is more the user-facing information. It's display name, it's URI, and stuff like that. This isn't really functional information about the client, because I've found that in implementing this over the years, OAuth's model of the client as an entity being a hanging point for a lot of things, like what rights of access, what types of functions you can do and stuff like that, ends up being a little bit weird. So in this case, this is the client just saying, here's how I describe myself, how you recognize me, what I can do. Those are all different things. They may be strongly associated with each other, but they are really different subsets of information. This got brought up. Vittorio actually raised this a little bit. I think we really need to have a separate way to say, this is the information I know about the user. This could be an assertion. This could be a set of verifiable credentials that I'm posting. This could be a username and password. This could be any number of things that I've collected to know about the user that I want to be able to tell to the AS. So we need to have a flexible way to assert that information to the AS and let the AS make its decisions. And finally, and we need to be able to describe to the AS how the client can interact with the user. So this is where we bridge to that front channel. There are two parts to it, and it's basically how can I get the user there, and how can I get the user back. In this particular example, I'm saying I can send the user to an arbitrary URL, and when I get them back, I'm going to be doing a redirect to a URI that I host, the canonical auth code flow. So at this point, the AS has all of this information, and it can decide what to do with it. It may very well decide that it has everything it needs to do to issue an access token, because that's the client credentials flow. That's a lot of the token exchange flows. That's the resource owner flow. There's a lot of cases in OAuth where we're already doing this, but we're doing different specialized things in order to do that. Or the auth server can look at all of that and say, hey, this isn't good enough, and I need to talk to the user. I need to talk to the user myself. So I am going to send you to an arbitrary URL that I host. This URL needs to be unique for the given transaction request. So this is not an authorization endpoint URL that the client adds stuff to. This is something that is generated and handed to the client just in response to this request, because each step in this process needs to point to the next. This closes the mix-up attack and a lot of other things that happen in the OAuth discovery space, because the client starts at one URL, it gets pointed to every next step. Nat actually proposed this in the OAuth world, I don't know, like 10 years ago or something like that, and we decided not to listen. I don't know why. The client then sends the user over to that URL, and it does not add any query parameters. It does not have a client ID. It does not add a state. It doesn't do anything like that, all right? Any information that the client needs to register for this is all sent in the back channel before any of this happens. So that all the client needs to do is say, hey, I've got this URL. I'll get the user over there. And the authorization server looks up the transaction information based on that unique incoming URL. That tells us what client we're talking to, what keys have been verified, what's being asked for, maybe even information about what user we're expecting, which can close a lot of the attacker problems, including the pixie-based attack that we were hearing about before, if the client knows something about what the user is. User does everything that you would expect here, and then they get sent back. Right now, I've got a separate state parameter that the client had pre-registered with that transaction request, and an interaction handle that comes back to the client. And then the client needs to validate that state value and send that back to the authorization server. Now, something that I kind of glossed over before was that when I got back that interaction URL, I was given what's called a transaction handle. That transaction handle is now used by the client. That's the first field there, in saying, I want to continue the transaction that I had already started. And to prove that I actually sent the user and went and did something, I have this this interaction handle. This is analogous to the authorization code, right? The client still has to prove possession of all keys that it referenced when it started the transaction. Even though it's now just presenting that transaction handle, it has to have be able to show that it still has control of all of the keys it had when it started that. And if the auth server decides that everything is all hunky-dory, it can send back an access token, and we are good to go. Now, I keep talking about this notion of handles, and so far we've seen how that they can be used for the for continuing the transaction. These can be used actually all throughout the system. So it might seem a little funny to people that like we're doing kind of a dynamic registration thing every time. We're always sending client information. We're always sending key information, stuff like that. That's kind of silly, right? Well, I agree, because the server can issue in response to either an initial transaction or an out-of-band interaction with the developer, a client handle and key handle that the client can use in lieu of the actual JSON document. And the transaction request then looks more like this. So instead of sending an object, I send, in this case, a string because it was a bearer type handle. It might be a hash of a string or any number of cryptographically bound operations that we could do with these things. And I send those over, and the auth server looks it up and says, oh, I know which client this is referring to. This is effectively replacing a client secret, but not giving up that key binding, right? The access token itself can also come back with a transaction handle. And why would we want to do that? Well, in OAuth 2, we decided that access tokens can now expire, and so we had to invent this weird thing called a refresh token, which was kind of a bearer token, but kind of not, and only in some circumstances and stuff like that. Well, I got to thinking that what is a refresh token except saying that I want to continue this transaction that I had already started with you and I already got approved. So we can use the same transaction handle mechanism that we use to get the token in the first place to get refresh tokens. So I'm just saying that that whole thing that we did before, if you still trust me, then I'm just asking for the next access token that's associated with this transaction. And again, the client has to prove its keys every time. What if I've got a really trusted client and I want, and the AS decides that, you know what, you've done all of these claims, maybe it's not the resource owner, but it's a third party requesting party kind of thing. UMA has this notion called a persisted claims token. We can use the user handle in this protocol to do the same kind of thing. That's a different rabbit hole. We're gonna go quick. And next up is scopes. A lot of the discussion around Torsten's structured scope example is that the simple scopes are still really, really useful. But I got to thinking, what is a scope except a shorthand way to say, I want this actually rather complicated slice of API? Well, if we just extend this notion of a handle representing an object that the client would otherwise send, we can now have an API decide that if you want this particular set of API rights, use this magical string, which also happens to be human readable and typable. In other words, it's an OAuth scope. One of the coolest things about this, though, is that you can combine the string-based scopes with the object-based sort of more detailed requests, which is something that developers have asked for years in the OAuth space. And there are clear semantics of how those things stick together, because each of those simple strings unpacks to one of those objects. And that's something that you need to be able to deal with anyway inside your API. Very, very quickly, this works for the device flow as well. I'm basically going to say I cannot send the user to an arbitrary URL. So I'm going to instead send them to a static URL that maybe has been configured on a web page or is in the little sticker that came on my box. But I can chirp out a user code and send to the user. So, okay, that's great. I'm going to tell the user, go here, enter that code. User shows up, does everything that you would expect, enters the code, and then the auth server can look up the transaction based on that user code, because it can no longer do it based on the incoming URL, because it's no longer an arbitrary runtime URL. Meanwhile, the device can go and poke the server and say that I want to be able to continue this transaction. Are we ready yet? And the server, anytime it gets poked with one of these transaction continue messages, can basically say, yeah, no, we're not done yet. You know, we're still waiting for somebody to go click a button or something like that. Hold off, wait 30 seconds. And by the way, next time you talk to me, here's a brand new transaction handle. This has to get rotated every single time through. This was something that we found in the UMA 2 protocol. This closes a whole bunch of problems when you rotate this kind of thing. Same thing, by the way, with the refresh token analog. Every time you would continue a transaction there, you rotate the handle. Anytime you come back from an interaction, if it's not ready yet or you can do more things, you rotate the handle. And since we had this discussion with the device flow, what about a combined URL? Well, what is a combined URL except saying that I can send the user to an arbitrary URL? Except that now I'm saying I can send them there by painting a QR code instead of by, you know, sort of artificially mashing these things together. You should be able to use these things side by side with each other. There are two different ways that I can get the user over to the auth server to interact. All right. What about identity? Aaron Parecki just wrote a great blog post about this. I think that we can pass identity assertions back just like we're doing with OAuth today. We can protect an identity API just like we're doing with OpenID Connect and OAuth today. And we can also send identity assertions, like I said at the beginning, in ways that are really hard to do with OAuth 2. We can also bind tokens in very Depop-ish kind of ways and OAuth MTLS kind of ways, because we have a mechanism for the client to be able to present and prove keys already to the authorization server. We can extend that and say that this access token that's coming back is no longer a bearer access token, is bound to a specific key that I can then reference, and you have to use the same proofing mechanisms to do that. A lot of the concepts of OAuth 2 are there. They've just been, you see a lot of like underscore handle going on here, because there's really a lot of abstraction that you can gain from this by stepping back from the sort of syntactic details of OAuth 2 itself and trying to look at things a little bit differently. If you really want to get down to it, this came from a conversation I had with Chuck Mortimer over at Salesforce, you could send in your client ID or client secret as your client handle and as your key handle. You can send in your scopes as resource handles. I mean, a lot of this does kind of collapse into the same types of concepts, but in ways that allow you to also do it in a more rich and robust way without losing the simple expressivity. Huge bunch of pros and cons. I think there were a lot of pros to this. I started working on this in earnest maybe about a year ago, trying to hack apart Oauth and see how it could be a little bit different. It, out of the box, does a wider set of use cases. I mean, the more legacy use cases that I throw at it, the more I find that stuff actually fits. It uses some multimodal JSON in order to make everything, fairly clean and expressive. I can do static and dynamic things. There's fewer moving parts, which is generally better for security. Cons, biggest one, it is not backwards compatible. This is not OAuth 2. It's just not. We can do a lot of the things that this protocol does with OAuth 2 as a base. We're already seeing it with FAPI resource object registration. We're seeing it with Depop. A lot of the bits and pieces are ideas that are pulled from these other things, but it's drastically simplified when we start with a different syntactical and, more importantly, semantic model base to build off of. Right? It is a huge, huge drawback that it is not OAuth 2 compatible, but I do think that these things can be deployed side by side with similar or related backing systems. So you can have one registration system and a transaction endpoint and an OAuth token endpoint that kind of live side by side. A downside is multimodal JSON, because that's kind of tricky to parse in some cases. But I will say I have implemented this in Java, which is one of the most annoyingly strongly typed languages out there. So if it's possible in Java, I think it's possible in almost anything. And my code's up on GitHub. It's linked from the site. So it's, you can do it. We don't know how this scales yet. There's a lot of question about statefulness and statelessness. And quite frankly, we don't know what's broken yet. But with that, I'm going to ask that, do we want to make this a working group item? I think that OAuth 2 is fantastic, and it will continue to live for a very long time because it solves tons of use cases really, really, really well. And I think a lot of the extensions that we're doing to OAuth make a lot of sense. We should keep doing that. I am proposing that we work on this as well as a sort of future edition of authorization and delegation protocols. I'm already building and deploying this with at least one of my clients, probably a couple more, because we are hitting use cases that OAuth cannot solve. And so we're looking for something new. Okay.
John Bradley, Yubico. I think you put a lot of work into this. It incorporates a lot of the extensions that we've done in OAuth. OAuth will not live forever, much like WS Fed may not live forever.
One can hope.
I think it may be useful to adopt this as perhaps experimental at this point and work on it, get the experience so that at some point in the future, I don't think that we necessarily want to signal people that, this is necessarily mature yet.
Oh, it's not.
Right, but
I'll tell you that now.
If we bring it in as experimental and say, this is stuff that we're looking at for the future, we want to develop it, so that by the time OAuth starts, people start hitting real boundaries with OAuth that they can't do, maybe we will have something that can be deployed. So I think it's something that's worth the work group tracking.
Okay, thank you.
Neil Jenkins, Fast Mail. Just wanted to say, firstly, the stage model sounds really good.
I'm sorry, can you speak closer?
I think the stage model sounds really good. This flow is worth looking at more, and particularly the kind of continuation token idea, and the fact that you have the handle process where you're kind of managing a state machine almost on your server and continue to go through. That's a model that we use for pretty much all our authentication flows like that, and find it very effective. So I think that has a lot of promise here.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the idea of it being a kind of a state machine is absolutely not new to this, but it's more, it forces it, it's explicit, it forces it to the foreground because, I mean, I've written like a half dozen OAuth server implementations at this point in my life, and that's what you do anyway.
You have to end up doing that if it's going to be secure.
Exactly.
And I think this just makes that alone, maps much better to that.
Right, exactly. Thank you. That's the idea.
Hi, Roman Janidu as the AD. So the working group can kind of figure out what they want to tackle, one thing or not. My quick squint is that we would need to talk about the charter.
Okay. No, that's a great point.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. Yeah, I think this is great work and stuff that we definitely want to dive into. I want to call attention to the fact that none of this overall idea of handles and workflows and whatnot is specific to authorization.
Yeah.
And I think there's sort of an underlying protocol here that is more broadly applicable and worth breaking out as its own thing.
Mm-hmm. So question to the ID, maybe we should consider an XYZ working group if there's wider applicability. I don't know.
I mean, absolutely, that would be one of the things that we would need to put on the table, because as we have the charter currently written, we really try to be crisp in drawing the box, which is there's specific things we're doing relative to OAuth, polishing, kind of security. This is not that.
This is not that. Yeah.
Just to quickly elaborate on what I mean by that, since it might not be clear to how I'm thinking about this, but essentially what you have here is a mechanism for kicking the end user out to another context to do something in a secure fashion.
Right.
Usually, and especially in this space, we think of that as needing to authenticate or authorize something, but that could be any number of things, such as needing to fix up an expired credit card because a credit card on file is expired, and thus the API call that the device tried to make failed.
Right.
Anything where the end user needs to be punted to a different context in order to do something interactive, this would apply to.
Yeah, thank you for that example. And that kind of thinking is exactly why in the straw man that I've written so far, I've called it the interaction URI and not the authorization URI. Because if you actually look at the UMA 2 specifications, the requesting party gets sent to interact and provide a bunch of claims, and UMA is very, very hand-wavy about what that means. It could very well be entering credit card information there. And so, yeah, that is well within the boundaries of my thinking on this as well. And whether that means that this is a larger thing than just authorization, I don't know.
Yeah.
But
yeah, we use a very similar pattern internally for looking at using it between like authorization services and the authentication stack. So they're separate, and then potentially even within the authentication stack, breaking up parts of the authentication process into independent workflows that operate separate from one another and have their own trust boundaries around them. So.
Right.
So I have 3 minutes, so please go ahead, Dick.
Dick Hart. So a few questions, a few comments. One of them is this working group started off working on OAuth 1 and then moved to OAuth 2. When I was working on OAuth 2, we tried to keep a number of the sort of semantics and thinking that we didn't break the, wasn't an extension of OAuth 1. So I think for the same reasons you're saying it needs to break, I would agree with those. I wish we were smarter back then and would have used more of a back channel handle. The reason we didn't is we were sort of following on what we thought did work in OAuth 1 and taking the parts that didn't work out. So I'm a big advocate of that. I think the challenge is going to be people got a lot of stuff deployed, right?
Yeah.
One advantage of it is that the model about how I make API calls hasn't changed, which is where most of all the code is.
Yes.
You're just changing how you go about getting those.
Right.
I wrote this comment on a list, and I think for us to get traction of people being interested in working on this and it not being like some curl 6 forever project that who knows what it solves, which I worry about, would be let's capture the use cases, what we're doing, as opposed to, one thing is addressing issues with OAuth 2, but I think even more importantly would be what are the use cases this solves that we can't easily solve with OAuth 2, because that'll drive adoption of people using it, and they'll say, oh, and it'll also do everything I was doing with OAuth 2, so I'll just use that all the way.
Right.
And I think that the solving new use cases will enable us to bring a bunch of energy on working on it, as opposed to fixing something that could be better, but already works.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And what has been driving my implementation of this is a set of use cases, which I'd be happy to talk with you offline about, spaces where OAuth 2 doesn't work because of the nature of kind of where the user and client sit in the process, don't fit with OAuth 2's model.
Well, not offline. It would be good if the rest of the group also knows about that.
I mean, so
okay, I mean, that's the summary.
Probably some things you can share offline that maybe you might not be able to share online, but
there's that too.
I think that for this, we want to get clear on what are the things you're trying to solve, and there's things that you've thought of, but there's probably many other things that the group hasn't done, and so we can get sort of a holistic idea, and then decide which things are in scope and which are out of scope, because one of the things where working groups really go sideways, everybody isn't on the same page of what we're solving. And someone says, well, it doesn't solve my thing and I want this. And we're really arguing, we're down in the technical details, even though we haven't got alignment on which problems we're trying to solve.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I really think that the sunrise of this is in the new use cases that don't fit the old model. I'm with you. So writing those down, I am absolutely agreeing with you.
Sorry, guys, we are running out of time. Jim?
Yeah, real quick, I'd like to speak in favor of rechartering and doing the work here rather than a new working group, just because this is so much building on what we've learned in doing OAuth 2. I would be afraid of the new working group losing some of the collected knowledge here. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, this is something that we need to take with Roman and discuss it offline. Okay?
Awesome.
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks, Justin. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Sorry, Annabelle.
No, Annabelle, Friday. I'll try to squeeze you there. Okay. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Which comes out of it?
Yeah. We've talked about it.